Welcome to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesh. We have three distinct topics today. First, starting out with the How Many Stops Act. How many times can you stop somebody in the street and the reporting on that? Also, we want to talk about tax breaks for Columbia University and NYU and the tax breaks that they're getting that could be going to the community. And finally, we're going to be looking at the statute of limitations for sex trafficking. As you can see, we have a lot to get to, so stay tuned. Today's verdict starts right now. Okay, welcome to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesh. We have joining us today, Christine Rivera from the Bronx Defenders, talking about the How Many Stops Act. Let's just start from the very beginning. What exactly do we mean when we say How Many Stops Act? What is that?
Sure. So it started off as a bill of two packages, but the main focus has been on the second bill, Intro 586, which would require the NYPD to report on all investigative encounters and stops between the NYPD and the public. And that's at its baseline level. It's really just a reporting bill because we're looking to look at the data and see if there are any problematic issues within that data.
Okay, well, what seems to be the problem here, because it looks like it's been vetoed by the mayor. Where's the pushback here?
Yeah, so I mean, this really dates back to 2013 when a federal judge found that the NYPD violated the Fourth Amendment rights of New Yorkers by conducting illegal searches, and then violated the 14th Amendment of New Yorkers for conducting their stop and frisk in a racially discriminatory manner. And that's what the data that we had available back then showed us. But right now, the federal monitor that was put in place by those cases only gives us data related to level 3 stop and frisk. But as a public defender, I know that a ton of these cases start off with level 1 and level 2 encounters, which are those lower level encounters that the bill actually requires that we get that data now. And we want to make sure that those same issues that we saw for level 3 stops is not happening with level 1 and level 2. But based on what we're seeing under this administration, unfortunately, in court, we're having judges find that the police acted illegally, and then those cases get dismissed. And we're seeing that happen a lot under this administration. And these cases are not holding up in court. And what happens? They get dismissed, and then our clients can file lawsuits. And now the city has to pay out the NYPD for conducting these illegal stops and frisks.
Let's talk about what Intro 586A requires officers to report, okay? Without needing to ask, and to the best of their ability, age, race, and gender of level 1, 2, and 3 stops. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah. So because the apparent race, gender, right? Because officers right now, they can't ascertain someone's race by seeing them, right? 911 dispatch, they say a certain race, color based on what the apparent race, color, age looks like of that individual. We're asking for that same exact data for level 1 and level 2. And because again, the NYPD was found to have broken that trust in the past because they enforced their policies in a racially discriminatory manner. And so we want to see that data to see if those same tactics are being used, because they're violating people's rights, and it's continuing to break that trust that was broken 10 years ago. We're trying to repair that trust and give the community the data that they're asking for.
Okay, it also requires that they let us know why they made the stop, how it began, and whether it escalated from one level to another. What does that mean?
Sure. So sometimes when an officer approaches someone for a level 1, right? And just to be clear, the level 1 and level 2s, these are not including casual conversations. These are investigative encounters, which by definition in the NYPD Patrol Guide is an interaction between law enforcement and the public for an investigative purpose or a law enforcement purpose. So answering someone's question about directions, shooting a couple hoops in the park with kids, giving someone that looks very, really hot some bottle of water in the summer, none of those need to be reported. And those types of interactions actually build community. So we want those interactions to happen. We just want to know the interactions where there is an investigative purpose or a law enforcement purpose. And if it starts off as just a regular conversation then leads into that, where they're actually asking questions that are more pointed, then we want to know the data. We want to know the information about that, because what brought them there in the first place.
I know
Yes.
you also want to know the final level of the stop. Am I correct?
Mhm. Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Sure. So like if it starts off as a level 1 encounter, and it during that conversation, more information comes out, and now the officer might see that person as a suspect. Now they're allowed to go into level 2 questioning, which is more pointed. That person's still free to leave, but most people don't feel free to leave once they actually get questioned like a suspect. And so we want to know, if it starts off as a basic conversation and leads to that level 2, we want to know the details about that.
And it looks like you also want to know whether there was force used during the stop. What do you mean by force, and what kind of force?
Sure. I mean, in the NYPD's already in their paperwork, it says was force used, and they have to check the box or not. And so that's for level 3s, and we want to know whether or not force was used for level 1s and level 2s. And the NYPD actually suggested that we added an additional question right during this whole process, because we've been working on this bill for a very long time. And so the thought that it's burdensome, yet they asked us to add a specific question, is kind of counterintuitive.
How would you say that the act really addresses potential biases or disparities in law enforcement practices? How do you think it's going to work?
I mean, I think that officers are going to maybe think twice about just stopping random people, right? They might think like, do I have an actual purpose here stopping this person, or am I just working off of a hunch, right? That's a legal term that judges use, but you can't just stop people based on a hunch. There has to be something about them, or something that they thought they did, or that they fit a description. You can't just approach people, intimidate them, and walk off as if that doesn't harm the community, and that doesn't contribute to the lack of trust that already exists in the community.
There was a question as to why it was needed, why this information is needed, and somebody said it was transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, that body-worn camera records show stops are being underreported and mischaracterized. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And I think it's actually the NYPD is required to submit their audits to the Federal Monitor. And these are the same conclusions that the Federal Monitor is coming based on the audits that the NYPD is sending them. I have not seen a report yet from the Federal Monitor that says the NYPD is in substantial compliance. It just says partial compliance, and that's due to the significant issue of underreporting. And this is now 10 years, which is why we're asking the City Council to step in, because clearly the Federal Monitor is not enough.
I don't have too much time. So what are your final thoughts on this? I mean, does it look like it's happening? It's going to happen? Where are we?
Yeah, I mean, I think we got the override. I think it's gonna be implemented now. I mean, the next step is implementation, ensuring this is implemented. I think at the heart of this is we want to build the trust between the NYPD and the community, and the only way to do that is through transparency, just like any other relationship in our lives. Transparency, accountability, trust. You need that for a healthy relationship, and that's what we want between the NYPD and the community. What's
the next step with this? I mean, is there anything else that we could do next other than figuring out how many stops? But what else can you possibly do? Yeah, I mean, listen, I think meeting with council members, they're open to meeting, and this is where this bill came from, was through council members actually listening to the stories of those on the ground, and reach out to us. We're happy to set up these meetings as well and guide people through the process of actually speaking with the folks that represent them in the city council. All right. Well, Christine Rivera, I want to thank you very much from Bronx Defenders. I think you outlined the How Many Stops Act very well, and it just gives the public a lot to think about. Yes. Thank you so much for having me. It's our pleasure. All right. Stay with us. Today's work has so much more coming up right after this. Welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesh. We have joining us today, Assemblyman District 36, Zoran Mamdani. Zoran, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, now we're going to be talking about tax breaks, switching it around a little bit, in particular, two particular universities. How did this even come onto your radar?
This has been something that the Professional Staff Congress, which is the union that represents CUNY staff and employees, has flagged for quite a long time, in that there are these two institutions, Columbia and NYU, that do not have to pay property taxes because of an exemption granted them in the state constitution. And while they do not have to pay property taxes on what would otherwise be $327 million a year in payments to the state, CUNY is being stripped for parts, death by a thousand cuts, really. And we're seeing that at so many different CUNY campuses, close to 20% of classes are being canceled at York College, and at Queens College, we're seeing dozens of staff being laid off. And so the union has been making clear that these two things cannot continue to exist at the same time. And once that was made clear to me, it became very obvious that there had to be a legislative intervention here to ensure that we finally stop leaving working class New Yorkers behind.
What specific property tax breaks are really currently being enjoyed by NYU and Columbia? What specific ones?
So in the state constitution, we state that any institution of higher education should receive an exemption from property taxes by virtue of the fact that its mission is that of education. Yet when that constitution was written, the intention of it was to provide relief to institutions whose, exactly as it says, their primary mission was education. But when you look at Columbia and NYU, you cannot say that this is their primary mission any longer. And I say that because Columbia is the largest private property owner in all of New York City. NYU is in the top 10. These are two institutions whose endowments make an annual return of about $1 billion. And while they exploit this exemption to extract more value from market properties than any other developer could, they do not have to pay a single dollar for their property taxes. And that is simply something that is untenable.
And what financial impacts do you think that these tax breaks have on the local community?
It's not very hard to think of what we could put $327 million toward on an annual basis, especially at a time when we are being told by our mayor, by our governor, that we need to make cuts to necessary public services. In New York City, we see that with the mayor closing Sunday service at libraries just to save $24 million, cutting children's school meals, cutting after school programs, cutting the universal 3K and pre-K program, all while we allow some of the wealthiest institutions in our city to not pay their fair share. And the idea of putting this money towards CUNY is because CUNY is the institution that educates the working class of New York City. 80% of CUNY students are coming out of New York City public schools, and more than 100,000 students are coming from families that make less than $30,000 a year. All of this while only 8% of their buildings are in a state of good repair.
Let me ask a question. In the past, has there been attempts to address this? Have they ever tried to do this before?
No, this is the first attempt with regards to repealing their property tax exemption, and it's something that is long overdue. We've seen this in other parts of the country where municipalities have taken steps towards having these institutions of this scale pay their fair share. But Columbia and NYU, they have not taken those kinds of steps, not in our city.
And how do they use the money? Like, what do they do with it? I don't understand. Buy more property? I don't get it.
I would say yes. They give a couple of they give some crumbs back to the community, a million here, a couple million there, which on its own might seem impressive, but when you compare it to the $327 million they would pay like any other institution, it's nothing. What they do with the money is continue to buy property. We've seen the value of their land holdings triple in the last 30 years. We've seen them embark on, redevelopments and expansion campaigns that total more than $1 billion. I mean, if you ask anybody who lives in the neighborhoods where these institutions are located, they can tell you that what used to be a campus is now becoming their entire neighborhood.
Does it look like this bill is going to get passed? I mean, what are your thoughts?
I'm optimistic. I'm not naive to the fact that this is a long fight. A constitutional amendment requires passing a bill in 2 consecutive legislative sessions. So the soonest we could pass this in those legislative sessions and then have it be voted on by the public is about a 3-year timetable. But I'm optimistic because this is an issue that unites New Yorkers across ideology. I've met so many New Yorkers who, when I tell them this fact, they're outraged because they didn't even know that Columbia and NYU were getting off on their property taxes. They assumed that an institution of that size, of that scale, that was engaging in this much property accumulation and development would be paying the same tax as any other institution of that scale.
Changing gears for a second, what else have you been working on in District 36? What other stuff do you have cooking?
So, one of the major focuses that I've had in this district and in my legislation for the state is around the MTA. This is the lifeblood of New York City, and for many New Yorkers, it is the way in which they engage with government on the most frequent basis. And so one of the things that we were fighting for last year was a campaign we launched called Fix the MTA. And as part of that campaign, we won a historic free bus pilot. And I'm so excited to be speaking to you in the Bronx because what we won was 1 free bus route in every single borough. And in the Bronx, that is the BX18A and B. And that's something that is a loop from East 170th and Grand Concourse. And what we've seen in that free bus pilot is 45,000 New Yorkers across 5 boroughs who now are able to put $2.90 that they would have spent on the bus towards the cost of eggs, the cost of groceries, the cost of their Con Ed, their rent. These are things that working class New Yorkers know add up. And what we're working on right now is we know that congestion pricing is coming in June. We need to make sure that we give New Yorkers a bus system that is worth their time and worth their money. And in order to do that, we have to invest money to make the buses more frequent, more reliable, and more affordable. So we're pushing right now for the state budget to include $90 million towards doing exactly that.
Well, we're gonna have to leave it there. Good stuff. Working hard for the community. We love to see that, Assemblyman Mandami. We really do appreciate it. Hopefully you can come back in the next couple of months, let us know how things are going with Columbia, NYU, and the MTA.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to be on. Thank you for having me.
That's our pleasure. All right, stay with us. Today's verdict has so much more right after this.
19.7% of Bronxites currently experience food insecurity. Meanwhile, instead of these nice, colorful foods, this is the best food that they have access to. If this sounds like you, there are a bunch of resources to get healthy food for free or cheap. If you want to help, you might consider donating or volunteering in one of these places. Community fridges like this one are all over the city and allow New Yorkers to conveniently donate extra food to people who might need it. Go to this link and find your nearest one. Food banks and pop-up events like these provide millions of healthy meals to families in need. These organizations are distributing meals to Bronxites as we speak and are always accepting donations and volunteers.
Okay, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesh. We have joining us today a special guest, Justin McNabney. Am I saying the right way? McNabney?
McNabney, yep, you got it.
The chief of the Special Victims Division. And we're going to be talking specifically about the statute of limitations and sex trafficking. How did we get here? If you could maybe start us from the very beginning.
So for most felonies in New York State, there's a 5-year statute of limitations. And so that means that if we don't bring charges within 5 years of a crime, of a felony, we generally are not allowed to charge that individual for the crime. There are some exceptions. It is a complicated area of the law, but in general, that is the rule. And so that is the rule that has always applied to sex trafficking. The sex trafficking statute is relatively new. It was enacted in 2007, so it hasn't been with us that long. But because it was enacted under that background, the statute of limitations has always been 5 years. Now, the legislature had previously recognized that with respect to, for example, rape in the first degree, 5 years just isn't long enough because for many survivors, it takes a very long time to be able to heal from the trauma of a very significant violent sexual assault, let alone be able to then participate in the criminal justice process, which requires a lot of survivors in order to work. And so the legislature eliminated the statute of limitations for rape in the first degree and other very serious sex crimes, but didn't touch the statute of limitations for sex trafficking. And so we are now asking the legislature to apply essentially that same logic to the crime of sex trafficking and eliminate the statute of limitations for sex trafficking so that survivors can come forward when they're ready, and we can still do something about the fact that they have been sex trafficked and hold their traffickers accountable.
Well, is it going to be an unlimited amount of time, or is there going to be maybe some type of compromise? What are your thoughts about that?
I think it needs to be unlimited because I think, again, it's unlimited for rape in the first degree. It's unlimited for murder. It's unlimited for kidnapping. It's unlimited for a lot of the most serious felonies. And this, and in my view, sex trafficking falls comfortably in that category. The level of violence that we see in most of our sex trafficking cases shocks the conscience. Like these are survivors who are being abused every single day. Most traffickers, for example, have rules that their victims have to follow, and the consequence for breaking a rule is violence. And the rule can be something as simple as, for many traffickers, they don't allow their victims to walk on the sidewalk. They have to walk in the street. And so if they see a victim walking on the sidewalk, they will assault that victim. And that is the lived experience of our survivors day in and day out through the years and years and years in which they're trafficked. And so in my view, because this crime is so serious, because it affects so many people so deeply, there should not be a limitation on our ability to hold traffickers accountable at all. If it takes a survivor 10 years to be able to talk about that experience, that horrific experience, and come to us and ask for justice, we should answer that call. And we shouldn't be limited by this 5-year bar, or frankly, any bar.
Is there a civil component to this as well in terms of bringing lawsuits, or is it just a criminal?
There is a civil component. I'll tell you, David, I'm a little less familiar with that part of the statute, but my understanding is it similarly alleviates the limitations on filing civil suits up to, I think, a certain number of years. I think it's a lot of years. I think it's maybe in the 50s, but I'm not entirely sure about that piece of the statute, other than I do know it would allow survivors, similar to the recent legislation that allowed survivors of sexual assault to file lawsuits. This bill would do the same thing for survivors of sex trafficking. And
I know the viewers also would like to know some of the other stuff, Justin, that you're working on in the Special Victims Division. What else are you working on?
So the Special Victims Division is comprised of the Child Abuse Bureau, what we call the Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Bureau, our Human Trafficking Unit, and our Elder Abuse Unit. And all 4 of those pieces are working very, very hard. One of the new innovations that we've sort of brought to the division recently is we've recognized that historically, domestic violence, intimate partner violence was kept separate from sexual violence. We saw those as 2 different kinds of crimes. And to some degree, they are. There are survivors of intimate partner violence who do not experience sexual violence. And there are certainly cases involving sexual violence between 2 strangers that don't have an intimate partner relationship. But we also recognize that there's a huge overlap between those things, that very often survivors of intimate partner violence are surviving sexual violence. And so we took those 2 practice areas and put them together so that if we do get a case involving a survivor of intimate partner violence who has been victimized in a sexual way, we have the skills and the ability to bring those charges just like we would bring a sexual assault charge in a case involving 2 strangers. So that's one big change that we've recently made, and we've already seen an improvement in our practice around getting to around charging sexual violence in the context of intimate partner violence. But that's a big area in which we've now, I think, improved our practice. And with the human trafficking unit, we've brought resources to bear on our human trafficking cases that really, I do think, are at the forefront of any local prosecutor's office in the country. We have a dedicated social worker who has spent her career, more than 10 years, working with survivors of human trafficking. And she is involved in every case. Every survivor who comes into the office meets with her, works with her. We also have dedicated investigators who have spent their careers investigating human trafficking. And we have 4 dedicated ADAs, along with a deputy chief and a unit chief, who are working exclusively on human trafficking cases and really getting the experience and the know-how to do these cases as well as they can be done. And I would put our practice up against anyone else's in terms of our ability to hold traffickers accountable, but also to support our survivors through the challenging process of bringing charges against their traffickers. So,
All right, well,
yeah, so we're very busy, David, is the bottom line.
it's all right, Justin, we're gonna have to leave it there, but hopefully you can come back maybe in the next couple of months, let us know how things are going with the sex trafficking and everything else, if that's okay.
Happy to do it.
All right, that's great. All right, today's verdict's coming back. Stay with us right after this.
I remember when the Bronx did not really have a media outlet properly representing the people of the Bronx.
BronxNet provides for the community by being a community where people can be empowered to share their voices.
We are in a really great place technologically. We've got all the resources that we need to be effective.
Whether it's through cameras, storytelling, editing, we have provided those services for 30 years.
BronxNet's mission is to be a voice for the community.
To educate, to inform, and to inspire.
And you can be a part of it. We've built studios for you.
Okay, well, that's all we have for today. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us, and of course, you, the viewers, for watching. If you have an issue or a topic that you'd like to see on a future edition of Today's Verdict, feel free to email me at davidlesh@bronxnet.org. And until I see you the next time, know your issues, reach a verdict. I'll see you in 2 weeks.